Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. As fall advances in the Northern Hemisphere and evenings and mornings get cooler, seems like an appropriate time to talk about time, including why we have problems with time and how to befriend time. Time is a great enigma for scientists, for philosophers. What exactly is time? And I'd like to suggest up front that one of the reasons we have trouble understanding time is that we think of time, we tend to, as a thing. The study of time, for instance, implies that there is a thing to study, that time is some sort of noun or object to which we can bring understanding. And I think that this move that we make, this habit that we have, is one of the reasons we fail to understand time. One philosopher who is preoccupied with time is Henri Bergson. And Bergson thought about two different kinds of time, one of which he considered real and one not. And so the sort of time that we mean by the watch, by the clock, objective time, linear time, that's for Bergson, that's the unreal time. That's constructed time. What he thought was real time was what we might call subjective time. And he used the word duration for that, la durée. And so duration is when time flies, as they say. When you're doing something you enjoy and you go into a space of timelessness and 3 hours have gone by. Or you're stuck at the Department of Motor Vehicles trying to renew your license because you didn't make an appointment on time. And there's a bunch of people in front of you, and the person standing in front of you takes an entire eye test, you know, those visual tests that they give people sometimes, and then says, maybe I should put my glasses on. And so they've just wasted 5 minutes of the hour or so that you're sitting there. So duration that way starts to look very slow. So we all know this, that subjective time goes slow when we don't want it to. It goes fast when we don't want it to. It varies. It's fluid. But it turns out that objective time also can vary. So for instance, the center of the Earth, the core of the Earth, is actually 2.5 years younger than the surface. There's science that shows this. Einstein predicted this. And so why would that be? Because the closer you get to a strong center of gravity, the more time slows down. So there's some variance in how time works. If you watch someone disappear into a black hole, which of course is an immense source of gravity, you would never see them cross the event horizon. That's how much things would slow down. And because time and space are two aspects, perhaps, of one continuum, Einstein used the term space-time. And so we can't really talk about time unless we talk about space, at least in some arenas. So at the beginning, when they say that the Big Bang burst forth, not really an explosion, more like a vast emanation, what unfurled was space and time itself. It's not like there was this huge burst of light in the middle of a void. There was no void. The void itself expanded. And at first, as it did so, the wave front, if you want to call it that, was moving faster than the speed of light. So when we look out at very distant stars and galaxies, we might actually be seeing them as they were millions of years ago. So in a sense, astronomy is also a form of time travel. So even in the world of objective time, there's some quirks about time that don't match our daily experience. There's also the feeling subjectively, but there's an objective basis to it as well, that time in industrial nations has been speeding up, that there isn't sufficient time to do everything, that there are immense demands on our time. And this might be a good place to mention that I actually just did a class, a video on demand class on how to befriend your time and make best use of your time, because I'm a busy person too. And I've had to learn a lot of tools and ideas over the years for how to do that. So if you're interested in that, there's a couple of places you can go. One of them is to my website, chalkwist.com, and then just click on the courses tab and it's in there. And if you want a direct link, you can go to vimeo.com/on-demand/concentrate your life. So there's that kind of time. There is the sense that mechanistic time, because our technologies are live that kind of time. They're getting faster and faster, and so we are too. There's this show that's on right now. It's a cartoon called Star Trek Lower Decks, and now and then I'll watch a cartoon, even though I'm an adult. And I tried to watch a little bit of that show, and the dialogue moves so fast, I can't understand it. So I gave up. And it's been noted, of course, that people who grew up with the internet, with video, with all this great tech that we now have, often have an easier time of understanding rapid fire speech and image than those of us who grew up in a somewhat slower time. I've had the same difficulty when I watch movie teasers and trailers. The images go by so quickly I can't understand what I'm looking at, so I usually just close my eyes. So my DMV example earlier touched on one of the most irritating things about living in a high-speed civilization, which is people who waste time. And I often think that might be actually be a form of unconscious revolt, that we're so subjected to schedules we didn't originate and timelines we didn't come up with, that we do everything possible to be passive aggressive about it, but without knowing it. And so I think about that sometimes when people waste my time. This week, I spent a huge amount of time talking to technical support people who didn't know what they were doing and wouldn't admit it. And it would have saved me a lot of time if they had just said up front, I have no idea how to help you, I'll get somebody else, right? So there was a tech support person who went out to my mom's house to fix her phone. He was out there for 4 or 5 hours, couldn't do anything. And so my mom's nursing assistant looked at the phone, realized that it was connected to a modem, looked at the back of the modem. There was a switch that had got bumped. She flipped it, and the phone worked. So I say, take all the money that the tech support person earned and give it to the nursing assistant. There is, too, a certain kind of entitlement about time wasting, that not about wasting, but about our reaction to it, where you're on your phone and you're looking something up, and then there's a glitch, and you have to wait a grand total of 5 seconds. And some of us are then like tapping on the surface of the phone. Come on, Really? 5 seconds? Shit, I grew up without these cell phones. So, there's that, right? When we live in a high-speed civilization, we get accustomed to getting things done right away. And when they're not, we get frustrated. So in terms of time management, I want to suggest that in addition to gaining some respect, perhaps more than Bergson had, for objective time, for linear time, that part of the time management game is in treating time as qualitative as well as quantitative. Jung writes about this, Carl Jung, in his introduction to the Wilhelm Baines translation of the I Ching, one of the oldest books in the world. It's an oracle, a divination tool that comes from China. Has a very long and rich philosophical history. And in the introduction to the Western translation of it, Jung makes the comment that in some cultures, Each moment of time has its own particular qualities that we can't measure. And so when you throw the coins of a I Ching reading, the reading and the question and the motions you're making all share in whatever that qualitative aspect of time is when you're doing the reading. So to illustrate this, Jung does a reading about the question of, should this book be introduced into the West? Is this a good thing to do? And the hexagram that came up, the I Ching is composed of 64 hexagrams. They're 6-line images built from the bottom up. And through 6 tosses of the coins, there's 3 coins that you use for this method. There's other ways of doing it too. The hexagram that gets built is called the well. And the I Ching describes itself as a source of nourishment. So that's one of the things that convinces Jung to actually go ahead and write what is now a fairly famous introduction to the I Ching for a Western audience. Jung believed that astrology works the same way. He was not fond of the causal model of astrology, that, a Mars transit makes people angry and stuff like that. For him, rather, to use an image I'm borrowing from Rick Tarnas, it's as though the configuration of the heavens at any particular moment is like a meaningful symbolic clock of those qualities of time. And this is one reason why in tropical astrology in the West, it doesn't matter that the constellations don't line up with what the time intervals are, the season intervals are. So as an example, as I'm recording this, Saturn is in Aquarius, which actually is a natal placement for me. And that has certain qualities. And so if you were to look up at the actual sky with one of those cool programs, one of those apps that show you where the constellations actually are, the stars and the planets themselves, on the app that I'm using, it looks like actually that Saturn is being emitted from the butt of Capricorn. So in sidereal astrology, Saturn is in Capricorn. But in terms of time, Saturn is in Aquarius. And that's because over many centuries, astrologers have learned that it's time that is important, not where the stars are. So whether you like divination or not, what I'm suggesting is that time can be focused on if we think of it as qualitative. And there's some easy ways to do that. One of them is, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, this is fall here in the Northern Hemisphere. And so I notice with myself that when the fall begins, I still feel very vigorous, but there's a hint that it's harvest time, which it actually is where I'm living, and that in another month and a half or 2 months, winter is going to come on and things are really going to slow down. And part of my project of Befriending Time has been trying to live as much as I can in accord with the seasons. So because winter, biologically, thematically, has been a time for rest, reflection, storytelling, certain kinds of ceremonial work, I pare back as much work as I can when the winter comes, and I try to do less so that I have time for that kind of reflection, reassessment, how did the year go, things like that. Another way of thinking about time qualitatively is there's an old Greek term, the kairos, the right time for something. And I notice that my intuition sometimes will feel a certain way when I have an idea about moving forward in some direction and it's not time. It's hard to describe, but it's something that can actually be cultivated. And so that happened to me recently. There were some projects I wanted to move forward with, and I kind of consulted my intuition. I kind of sat with it, and there was this feeling of I got this image of um, a river being dredged right in front of me, and then I took this into dreams, and I dreamed that I was looking for something, but getting lost, things like that. And so when I woke up, I went, "Oh, well, it's not the right time to do this. I mean, this is, that's clear, right?" So I'm going to give it, 3 or 4 weeks and check in again. So that's something that divination lets you do, but you can also just consult your intuition directly. Incidentally, I have an anecdote about that word kairos. Years ago, I was teaching mythology in grad school, and mythology from a psychological perspective. And we were talking about how our names often have a mythological background to them if we take the etymology far back enough. Most baby name books don't do that, they just give you an easy meaning for a name. But if you do some homework on your name, you'll eventually get into mythic and storied territory. And so there was a pregnant woman in my class, and one of my students, and she said, I'd really love to know what to name my baby. I know she's going to be a girl, but I don't have no idea what to call her. So I suggested that night, when she went to sleep, when she felt in kind of that daydreamy edge place that happens to us before we fully fall asleep, that she focus on her unborn child and ask her for a dream about the child's name. Why not? So this mother came in beaming the next week and said, "I did exactly what you suggested. I saw my daughter in a dream, and she said my name is Kyra." So that's her name. That was so many years ago. Kyra is probably, I don't know, 9 or 10 by now. I haven't had a chance to meet her. I'm curious what she's like. She must be remarkable. Her name so closely resembles Kairos, right? So a time for everything, and using one's intuition to know when that is can be a valuable way of treating time as qualitative. Another aspect to this is thinking about time as a flow of becoming. And here I'm leaning a little bit on the philosopher Merleau-Ponty. Thinking of time as becoming, that there is a growth, a ripening happening, which makes sense. If there was no becoming, then nothing would exist. So to ask oneself what needs to become now, and that includes dying, that includes things dying away, falling off, things that we move beyond. What are we moving beyond in this moment so that we can see new things get born in the next moment? What is going away and what is coming toward us? That's a way of thinking about time qualitatively. Another involves the use of imagination for an exercise, and this is to think of time as an entity, as a living being. And here I'm leaning a bit on some of the time gods from the world's mythologies. Zervan, Aeon, Kronos, some of them, as though time were a sort of god, or as Jungians would say, an archetype, which it surely is. So what is the archetype of time up to right now? Does it seem like it wants to go a little faster or a little slower? What's the lesson? How does it appear? It's an interesting fantasy to entertain. What would time look like if it was standing right in front of you, right? Now, there's a piece of advice that we've all heard that has some truth in it, and it's to value each moment, because each moment is unique and it will never come again. And for some of us, I think this needs to work in balance with planning, that the two are not necessarily opposed to each other. And the reason I put these together, they don't always have to be together, but it can be anxiety provoking to just try to live in the moment and forget about tomorrow. That's a move that is sort of what Jung would call puer or puella. That's Latin for uh, boy or girl, and I'm referring to the archetype of the divine child, which is kind of a Peter Pan figure in a way. Never commits, never lands, always dashing off to adventures, flights of ideas, things like that. And when you live like that, you can't really get anything done. So that's why I say that the whole thing of you know live like the flowers in the field. It sounds like puer psychology, which is great until you have to pay the bills, or including the student loan money, right, or the rent. Um, so what I'm suggesting is that side of things, which is more senex, to use another Latin word, means old man, old woman. The two go together. Puer and senex should work together. So to make the plans, to be responsible, and so that you can clear the space for those times when you can really enjoy the moment. And I talk a little bit more about this in the course I mentioned earlier on Concentrate Your Life. So you might want to have a look at that. But years and years ago when I got married, I got a piece of advice from the photographer that outlasted the marriage. And at one point, seeing that I looked a little bit bewildered, he pulled me to one side and he said, I've been at a lot of weddings, and I want to give you some advice for negotiating this one. So he said, this day will go faster than any day in your life. So what you want to do is breathe and feel your body and stop and just notice things. Because if you don't do that, all you're going to have afterwards are, in addition to a new wife, you'll have some photographs and a few scattered memories. But if you really stop and live the day, throughout the day, it'll be a lot more vivid in your recollection. And so I've since given that advice in modified form to students going through various rituals like defending their dissertation, or friends going through some kind of a ceremony, or some other peak experience where we really want to remember what happened afterwards. And it's good advice. Really helps embody consciousness in the moment as it unfolds. And the moment then is not a noun. It's a flow of becoming that slows down. A lot of psychological research shows what everyday experience tells us, that the more we pay attention to the moment, the more it slows down. And then there are those periods where we wish time would go faster. So during those, one thing you might try is to use the time. So when I had long commutes in the Bay Area, I actually used to meditate on the BART. The BART is the subway up there. I had about an hour and a half ride in, hour and a half ride out. And so I would do things like count my breaths. The other day I was getting my teeth cleaned. So there's, an hour or so of sitting in the chair while someone works on you. And this was somebody I hadn't met before. So oftentimes when I'm people watching, I play the Sherlock Holmes game. What can I deduce about the tiny details I notice about people, about my surroundings? What can I learn that way? You can also use the time to daydream, to fantasize. You can use it to make plans. If you have a book with you or some books on your phone, you can use it to learn and memorize. And in the Concentrate Your Life course, I talk a little bit about memory tricks, learning new information, and having it actually stick. One thing that I kind of got out of the habit of doing, and then get reminded of it every time I visit San Diego, which is where I was born and I grew up in the county. When you're standing in line somewhere, waiting for something, or waiting for public transport or whatever, um, San Diegans will often just strike up a conversation and pass the time that way, and you can get to know people. So at some point, I resurrected that habit, and when I'm standing in line, I'll sometimes make small talk with people, um, which can actually go in a fairly deep direction sometimes. But I have a lot of introverted friends who say I can't make small talk, but it's really a skill that you can learn like any other, and it's actually enjoyable when you know how to do it. You get to learn more about other people, and get astonished by what you find. There have been times when I've been on a plane ride with somebody or on a bus or wherever it is, and I realize that the two of us have a strong common interest in something, and then we spend the time talking about it, and time flies. Whatever uses we make of time, we can be sure that it always moves. I've been rereading the Bible recently, and there's the book of Ecclesiastes, which is traditionally Solomon's book from the 9th century, but there's a term that comes in some translations, vanity, all is vanity, and the more accurate word in Hebrew is vapor, meaning all things pass away. So the emphasis in Ecclesiastes is transience, but there's a beautiful passage, we've all probably heard at least some of it, on how these transient moments have different uses. So I thought I would just read a little bit of that. This is the Revised Standard Edition. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill, a time to heal. A time to break down, a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. I like that last, a time to gather stones together. What stones do we need to gather just now? What do we need to build? There's so much talk about destruction and deconstruction and all that, necessary in its place, of course, but maybe the larger question for this collective time that we're all living in is what new things need to be built? What new relationships do we need to weave? What new visions do we need to tend? From the Proverbs, which are also attributed to Solomon, we get the idea that, or actually observation, truth, that when there is no vision, the people perish. And the converse of that, of course, is that when there is a vision, the people flourish. A vision gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, solidarity. It allows us opportunities to express our compassion and humaneness. It gives us next steps to take together toward the world that we want to be a part of. So perhaps the task for our time is relearning the art of dreaming together so that we can use our time on this earth well. Thank you.